this is Julie Noyes, your instructor for the watercolor class. This is lesson 3. I'm very excited about this class because it's on Cityscape. So we are going to be doing different techniques. Now when I say cityscape, you can do a rural scene. You can do, something that's from your imagination. You can do something from a photograph that you've taken. I would like it to be original. I don't want you to do a copy from the internet. You can find your ideas, you can get some fabulous inspiration from the internet, but this needs to be yours. The cityscape is one of my favorite subject matters, so I really do like it. Don't forget, if you're texting me, please text and don't email the number 402-615-2789. And make sure you identify yourself, your name, and what class, because I do teach other classes. What I like to do, and I always do this, I always start with an inspiration. So I actually took some photos. This is downtown Lincoln. This is at the corner of 9th and O Street. And then I do little thumbnails. And you're required to do this for the class too. So the thumbnail, as you know, since this is already lesson 3, the thumbnail shows me what you're thinking. It's just a little composition. You start to figure out what you like, what you don't like, how you're going to repeat things. It's your blueprint. It's your idea. So this is very important because if you don't have any ideas, you can just kind of fumble around and never really feel very sure of what you want to do or how you're going to do it. So this is very helpful. You might even do a more detailed sketch like this before you do your final painting. Or you might do something like this that is a fully realized little painting. So this is another one of my photographs. It's very abstracted. It was at night, and I like this lost and found edges, the ambiguity of this. So we're going to be learning some new techniques today. So the techniques I'm showing you will be required in your cityscape. But they're not hard to do. They're actually really fun. So let's get started. So you always have the little sample sheet to do. So today, these are the techniques we're going to be doing on your sample sheet, and you'll actually work on your sample sheet, or you could work on watercolor paper too. This is really thin El Cheapo paper, so it's actually a lot harder to work on than watercolor paper. So I know if you can do it on this, you can definitely do it on watercolor paper. So we're going to start with the first technique, and the first technique is called big and small shapes, or small and big shapes. So for this is really also a compositional idea, so you don't have all big shapes, all little shapes, or all medium-sized shapes. So what I mean by this, you can see that here are some big shapes, here are some medium shapes, and here are some small shapes. We don't want everything to be the same because it's just really boring that way. So this is actually one technique. I don't need to demonstrate this. You can just keep this in mind when you're figuring out your cityscape. Big shapes could be the sky, medium shapes could be the buildings, smaller shapes could be the windows. You decide. So that is actually technique number 1. Technique number 2 is called sgraffito, or scratching. And this is a technique that was developed in the Renaissance, so it's not anything new at all. So you put your watercolor down and you let it dry. This does not work very well if the paint and paper are still wet, so you want it to totally dry. And then you go in, you can do a razor blade, an X-Acto knife, anything that's sharp. It could even be a scissors, but you're going to go in and actually scratch through. And see how what I did right there? I'm actually scratching in to the paper. And our paper is thick enough that it's not going to go through. On our typing paper, our copy paper, yes, it's a different deal. So make sure the watercolor is dry first, and look at this effect you can get. I mean, does that remind you of stars? Would these be little lights in the window? Could these be highlights on someone's face? Any place where you want little flickers of white, this is a great technique. And see how you can run it along and create long strokes. So it takes a little practice, but it's actually very easy to do. So you can call it scratching, or the Renaissance term is sgraffito. So this is technique number 2. Number 3 is called plastic lift. This is a really fun technique. You're going to love this. And you actually use plastic. And you can use any kind of plastic. It can be, thick plastic. It can be thin plastic. The thin plastic like this is going to create more wrinkles and more texture. The thicker the paper, the less texture it's going to create, and the bigger the shapes. So you can try it and see a variety of what you like to do. So I'll demonstrate this, but I want to show you first the effect. So right here is using this plastic lift. So we're putting colors down first, and I'll show you with this. I'm going to put some color down and some more color down. And I might leave some white of the paper showing through. And then I'm going to crumple the paper, the plastic, and put it on top of the wet paint. And I can see where the plastic is touching the paper, it's going to leave a pattern or an impression. Now we're going to want to weight this down right away, so the plastic is being held down, or else it's not going to produce any effect. So I can see right away if it's going to work or not. So look at your plastic and see where it's touching the paper, and that's the impression you're going to get. So this is one I just did a couple minutes ago to show you. Okay, so it has the paint underneath, and here's the plastic on top. So I'm going to take this off while it's still wet. Now, if I would let this dry overnight, that impression would show a lot more. So I want you to see, it shows a little bit here, but it really doesn't show that much. So leave the plastic on longer, put plenty of paint, plenty of water on your paper, and then make sure you weight it down. Because if you just put it like this, it's not going to do much. It needs to be weighted down. And the more you do this, the more you'll be able to control it. So for here, this one, you can actually see this is where the plastic was touching the paper. So you can get lots of different effects. Here was with really thin plastic and doing a whole sheet of this, getting some more impression here, less here, more here, less here. So you can, you can really manipulate this the way you want it to be. Here I can use it as a foreground, I can use it in the trees, I can use it in the background. So I think you're starting to get the idea of the plastic lift. I can use it with very light colors like this. They don't all have to be dark colors for that impression or pattern to show. But I can certainly use bold colors like this. So you can see this is where the plastic was touching the paper and the paint, and these areas the plastic was not touching. So that creates that variety. You can use different kinds of paints, and you can do this more than one time. So say you don't like it the first time, let it dry, and do it again. Apply more paint, put the plastic on, and let it dry again. You can do it over and over. So this is one that I'm also using metallic watercolor. So you can use a lot of varieties of paints. This would also work with acrylics. So this is called plastic lift. So you might think, okay, where could I use that in my cityscape? And you could use it in your foreground, in your clouds, part of the building, anywhere where you want to add texture. Our next technique is called slide and glide. And this is a technique that you will be using pretty much on all of your paintings. It's a very common watercolor technique. I call it slide and glide because it actually tells you what to do. So you are taking, say I want to make an edge, and this paper is quite buckled, but you can use it, or you can use your little technique sheet. But say I want to create an edge. It seems like students have the most trouble creating an edge. So to do this, if you can make your paint come up to the edge and slide it, slide, 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 slide. Notice how I'm not lifting my brush, sliding, 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 sliding. And if I need more paint or to fill out this, I can always fill this in very quickly. And if I don't like an edge, I didn't fill in that edge exactly like I wanted, I can go back while it's still wet. So this is called slide and glide. So you're putting your brush down and you're leaving it there and sliding it along. So for example, here you can see where maybe my brush is even drying out and I have to go back and get more paint, but I'm resuming back to the edge and sliding it along. You know, in a lot of your paintings, you're going to want to get this technique where you can come up to an edge, let that dry, and then maybe you're painting this edge, this color. So let those dry so this is not going to bleed into this while it's still wet. So this is a very common technique. I call it slide and glide. So we're working our way down. We already did this, big and small shapes, sgraffito, and lifting. Now we did the slide and glide. Next, we're going to do edging with tapes. So tape is a resist because the paint doesn't go through it. And this is a wonderful technique of using tape. You can cut it, you can shape it, you can curl it, you can tear it, but because it becomes a resist, I'm putting the tape down on my dry watercolor paper. It has to be dry or the paint simply is not going to stick. So I have it pressed down. If my tape is really old, then it's not going to work as well. So I want a nice fresh tape, having it pressed down, and then I'm simply going to paint over that tape, the edge, because I'm trying to create an edge. I'm trying to create a shape. So you can see those two pieces of tape? Yes? Okay. So I could let that dry, and then that shape, that edge is going to be more crisp and it's going to show up more. Now if the tape is old, the paint starts to fill in underneath the edge, which you might or might not like. Or if you're really impatient, you can take it off right away, but sometimes when we do that, the paint will start to fill back in. It did a little bit right there, but actually it worked pretty good. So see how I can create a shape very quickly, and I mean, if I had to paint this shape, it might take a long time, but by using tape as a resist, it's very quick and very easy. So I can use this over areas that are already done. So say I have weeds here, I could put more shapes down here, part of clouds. The other thing I like to do with tape, it's a different type of tape, is this is drywall patching tape. And this is an idea I came up with. One day I was at the hardware store, and I saw this drywall tape, and it's sticky on one side. It's actually for putting pieces of drywall together and patching them, but it's very sticky and it creates this pattern right here. So I can put this down, I can put it down on top of something that I've already painted. So I'm pressing it down really good, Or some areas, maybe I don't want it to show as much. You can decide. Once you've done this, it's really, really fun to see. And I'm going to paint over it, but maybe I don't want to paint every area. Maybe I want, if this is going to be windows on a cityscape, maybe I don't want them to all show. Maybe I want to be kind of hit or miss and not have it look so perfect and so structured. So I'm simply painting over the drywall tape, and underneath I already have another pattern going on, so I can paint on top of something that's already there. So you can see I didn't paint every little part of this drywall tape. Now for this, if I take it off, I know it's really going to run because I have a lot of paint. So I think I'm going to let this dry. And so I'm just going to set it aside and let that dry, and I will show you some other examples of how you can use tape. So different edges, cut edges. Here's drywall tape. So I'm painting some of it. I'm not painting all of it. Here is a dried edge that is torn. These are taped edges. Some of them I would take them off while they're still wet, and it would create a softer, more ragged edge. I could tear the tape. So you can see that the tape idea is really awesome and will give you a lot of variety. So for your cityscape, you could actually do all your buildings using this idea. So I could tape these all down, paint over it with the sky. So these are the masking tape areas, and here's the drywall tape. I even put them down here, did my painting over it, let it dry, took all the tape off. I actually had tape down here too because I want this to be a reflection in the water. But now I've painted over that. I don't want that to be as white as these buildings. So now I can go ahead and create more with the cityscape. But the big patterns are there. And even though maybe this took me 10 minutes to tape this, to actually paint these nice edges without any kind of resist here would take a couple hours. So it can really be time saving. Plus I like to see what shapes I have right away before I even paint it. So if I don't like it, I can add more tape, I can take off tape, but I have this luxury of creating these tiny little shapes that might be very hard to paint. And here's the drywall. Here's the drywall tape. So here's one where I cut. Here I'm painting some of it. I'm painting different edges. So wherever you're seeing the white, that was where the tape was sticking to the paper. And these little windows are the little spaces, the open spaces on the tape that the paint could go through. Isn't this a fun technique? So this is a resist technique. It's using tape. Our next trick is going to be doing corrections. Often when you're doing a painting, you think, oh, I don't like that, it's ruined. Nothing's ever ruined with painting. You can always correct. There's lots of ways that you can correct things. And in our book on page 88 and 89, there are some ideas for correcting. But I want to show you some ideas that maybe you wouldn't think about doing. First of all, if you can zoom in here, say this area is a mistake, but I could simply paint over it. And there are paints that are white, they're opaque, you can't see through them, opaque. And this is a gouache, and it's a white, so I can simply paint over, paint over, paint over, until that mistake is covered up. So that's one option. Another option is you could actually scratch it off. Now it does change the surface of your paper, but you could use sandpaper, you could use an X-Acto knife, where we're actually, paint is dry of course, going back in and scratching, 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 scratching it off. So if it's just a little mistake, a razor blade or X-Acto knife might just be perfect. Another technique is, say I just didn't like this area, I'm going to find something from a magazine and glue on top of the mistake. So it's collaging. So you can use you know, whatever kind of glue, like Elmer's would work, and I'm simply gluing something over that mistake. So instead of it becoming a mistake, it becomes a new part of my watercolor. So we're collaging over it. You can use a sponge. Now it has to be wet, and the thing about if this paint is already dried, it's a lot of work to go in and lighten an area. It can be done. Because our watercolor is water soluble, it will always change with water. So I can go in and I am lightening this area with this wet sponge. Okay, another idea, number 5 in ways to correct, I can go over an area, instead of with white, I can go over an area with a darker color and cover up what's underneath. You might have to go over an area 2 or 3 times to really cover it up. So that just gives you some ideas on making corrections. Most of the time what I think with watercolor though, I go with it the way it is. I challenge myself. Some things appear to be mistakes, but they might be what you really like about your painting, which leads us into our last technique. It's called back runs or run backs. And often this is a mistake. We don't really want a run back, but if you can learn to control a run back, it can be quite interesting. So this little edge, this edge, this edge, this edge, these are considered run backs. So with run backs, what happens is you have some wet paint down, but it's starting to dry, it's not that wet, and then you drop in another color that's really wet, and it starts to run back into the paint that it's already on. So you can get, I mean, look at this. This is pretty controlled, where I'm doing an edge that looks like a wave. I have to tell you though, run backs are a lot harder to control than what you're seeing here. It does take practice. So, for example, here, this edge, this frilly edge, that's a good example of a run back. This, not good, because these are paints that they're really not doing much. They're just kind of sitting next to each other. They were too much the same amount of water. This one is okay because you start to see some of these run backs. Here, by adding more water, we're going to get more run backs, and we're going to get that kind of frilly edge. So what we want to do with this is we're going to put some paint down, and it can be more than one color. I just let those 2 colors go together. You know, that's our technique called wet into wet. But now I'm going to add a lot more color that has a lot of water in it. So we'll see if this has a lot more water or not, and if it creates a run back. It did, instantly. I don't know if you can see that, if you can zoom up close enough. So my last brush stroke had a lot of water, and it instantly creates these little frilly edges here that go back. The thing about this, I can't pick it up or else it'll all just run together. So you have to practice this. So I'll go over this again. I put a color down. This color is wet, but it's certainly not dripping wet. And I'm going to run it together with this another color. So actually that's creating a little run back right here because this blue had more water in it than the orange. But I can add even more. I'm going to dilute this water down, or this brush down, and have even more water in this area. And I have to have more water than that last blue, and it's starting to create an edge here. This is going to show up even more than the first one. So we're going to let those dry, and if you pick these up, they just dissolve. So with watercolor, if you want the effect, stop, let it dry, and you can get these really wild effects that are called run backs. So you might want to use that in your water, in a cityscape, in a cloud. Now these could be, you know, in the distance, because these don't really show up very much. But the reason they don't show up, this is almost all the same color, yellow-green. So if you want the run back to really show, use distinctly different colors. So that completes our techniques for today. So don't forget, in this sheet, this is your thumbnail sketch sheet. And so you have to do your little thumbnail sketch here. And in your painting, make sure you incorporate all the techniques we learned today. There were 7 techniques. This is how you get your points. So one thing I didn't include was using different types of lines. And you do incorporate lines all the time. I mean, it's impossible to not do watercolor and have a variety of lines. But just to, we've talked about this before, but for a variety of lines, you want to get some thin, you want to get some scraggly, you want to get some rough. You don't want all the lines in your painting to be the same. So I'm always looking for that because that creates variety. So that is very easy to incorporate. Backgrounds, corrections, big versus small, sgraffito, taped, plastic lift, slide and glide. So those are things that we have talked about today. Now one of the things you will need to do then, you'll have your sample sheet done, and you'll do your thumbnail sketch here, but don't forget you actually get points. You get 5 points per painting. At the bottom of this, I want you to look up an artist and say their name, when they were born, when they died, and if you can, include a little thumbnail photo of their work or a little sketch. Tell me the title of their work, why you liked it or why you didn't like it, and then what you would do differently. So you get 5 points for that. So that's required with each one of your little thumbnails. And the reason I want to incorporate that is I want you to start looking to see what other artists are doing, and they can be famous artists or just someone you like. So I want you to include that information so you actually get points for that. So that is required on this sheet. So if I were you, I would first practice the samples. Do the techniques until you feel confident. And you don't have to just do them one time on our sheet. You can do them many times and do them on different kinds of papers. So get those down where you're, because you'll be using these all semester, and they're fun. There aren't any of these that are that hard. So just practice and have fun with those. So that's what you could do to start with. Then you could look up the artists that you like or don't like and write down that information. And then take a photo or figure out, what do you want for your cityscape? Do you want it rural? Do you want it cosmopolitan? Any kind of city or building scape is going to work for this assignment. So you decide. It doesn't have to be just city per se. So then you'll be doing your sketch here, and as you're doing this, you might think, okay, I'm going to do sgraffito on the buildings. Oh, I think I might tape the cityscape in the buildings itself. Maybe I'll do plastic wrap, that plastic lift in the sky for kind of soft clouds. 3 types of line, well that's going to be pretty easy to do. I'm doing some windows, I'm doing some doors. Slide and glide, well I'm going to be using that on a lot of the edges to create a crisp edge. So be thinking about these as you're doing your sketch, and then you'll be ready to start your painting. This is Julia Noyes. This is our painting number 3, our cityscape. Thank you so much.